After the Second World War, American cars would start to grow, longer and wider, although lower, while in most of the rest of the world, cars got significantly smaller, quite quickly. This led to new segments of smaller cars, even in the American market, such as compacts in the 50s and early 60s, and then subcompacts in the late 60s and early 70s. But most cars in the various U.S. segments continued to get bigger, to the point that small American cars were being sold as large executive cars outside the U.S., and large American cars were some of the biggest cars ever. It became clear that better use of space would mean smaller, lighter cars that were cheaper to build, more efficient to operate, and be nearly as roomy for passengers. And the success of premium compacts, such as the Ford Granada, Dodge Diplomat, and Cadillac Seville, suggested buyers were not hooked on the bigger is better mentality. So GM downsized their large cars for 1977, with Ford and Chrysler following 2 years later. The mid-sized GM cars would get their turn in 1978, again leading the market, and eventually the small cars would get downsized as well. Then the 80s would see another round of downsized American cars, eventually putting domestic and import cars on a more even playing field in relation to size. But how did this work out for the domestic brands? Well, the downsized full-size Chevy sold more than 670,000 for 1977, regaining its position as the best-selling car in America, with sales being up 45% from the previous year. Although when the previous design was introduced in 1971, Chevy sold a similar 650,000 of them, and when the 77 design was 5 years old, sales were already below 200,000, significantly less than they were in 1976. The downsized 79 Ford sold just over 360,000, only up about 50,000 from the year before, but much lower than the 1 million the previous model sold at its introduction way back in 1969. And like Chevy, sales declined at a faster rate. After being gone for 2 years, a downsized Grand Fury returned to Plymouth's lineup for 1980, with sales just below 20,000. It was just over a third of the previous model's final year of sales. What about the higher-end models? Chrysler sold 130,000 full-size sedans for 1979, the best year since 1973, when they still only sold full-size models, up from 45,000 the year before they downsized, and temporarily challenging the smaller LeBaron as its best-selling model, before a huge and rapid decline, and then being downsized again. Cadillac had a record year in 1977, and yet sales of the downsized standard model was down by 50,000 from over 260,000, not counting the bigger Fleetwood, which remained fairly steady at about 2,500. Lincoln was the last to downsize their full-size models in 1980, going from the least economical to the most economical in its segment, and yet sales dropped from just over 90,000 to just over 30,000. Suggesting buyers were not holding out for a smaller, more economical model, and that Lincoln had actually benefited from the delay. But downsizing the biggest American car seemed like a logical move for the time, and although it didn't appear to be terribly successful, there were several other factors involved in the decline of the segment. GM's large personal coupes were also downsized in 1979, and while Buick Riviera sales dropped 6,000 and Cadillac Eldorado sales dropped 3,000, Oldsmobile Toronado sales climbed 10,000 to 33,000, but still 15,000 behind the class-leading Cadillac. Lincoln's Mark V became the downsized Mark VI in 1980, with sales dropping from just over 75,000 to under 40,000. The downsized Thunderbird of 1977 is a different story completely. Instead of being a case of making a smaller car to compete in the same segment, the Thunderbird was downsized to change market segments, from competing with the Buick Riviera to competing with the Chevy Monte Carlo, and included a price drop of more than 30%, which might explain why sales jumped from 53,000 to nearly 320,000. In a similar fashion, Pontiac downsized the Grand Prix way back in 1969, moving it from a full-size to a mid-size platform. Although the move was not considered down market, and it only lost a few inches and about 300 pounds, with prices remaining similar, but sales increased from just over 30,000 to just over 110,000. And the mid-size segment is a lot more complicated. for several reasons, not the least of which is how the models were or were not grouped together. For example, Chevrolet's Monte Carlo was considered an independent model from the similar Malibu, while Oldsmobile's version of the Monte Carlo was just considered another version of the Cutlass. Mercury did something similar in the late 70s with the Cougar, with all mid-sized Mercs being Cougars. But Ford didn't do that with the Thunderbird. And outside of GM, mid-sized cars didn't so much as get downsized as model names were shifted around, at least for the first round of downsizing. Chevy's downsized Malibu sold 360,000 for 1978, up about 30,000 from the year before, but down more than 25,000 from the previous model's introduction in 1973, and by 1981, sales would be down to just over 240,000. The downsized Monte Carlo also sold about 360,000 for the year, down 50,000 from the year before. And the class-leading Oldsmobile? Sales dropped 105,000 to less than 530,000, which you might notice is less than the combined Malibu Monte Carlo sales for both years. For 1980, Ford introduced the new Fox body Thunderbird, followed by the Granada the following year. And although that would make for a downsized Thunderbird, while staying in the same segment, the Granada had essentially pushed the bigger and slower-selling LTD2 out of existence for 1980. In 1979, Ford sold 50,000 LTD2s and 180,000 Granadas. But for 1980, only sold 90,000 Granadas, with no LTD2 being offered. But sales climbed back up to 120,000 with the slightly smaller 1981 model Granada, while the downsized Thunderbird dropped from 285,000 to 155,000, continuing to drop rapidly until the 1983 restyle. At Chrysler, the LeBaron and the Dodge Diplomat became the mid-sized offerings by default, when the last of the B-body cars were discontinued, and then becoming the full-sized offerings a few years later. The last year they were sold together, the smaller Diplomat outsold the Monaco by more than 20,000 cars, 79,000 versus 55,000. But the B-body cars also included the Dodge Charger and Magnum and the Chrysler Cordoba, which would be downsized for 1980 when the Dodge took on the Murata name. And while first-year Murata sales would be 2,500 more than the 30,000 of the outgoing Magnum, Cordoba sales would drop nearly 20,000 from just under 90,000. It seems buyers were more okay with smaller mid-sized family cars than with smaller touring coupes, which seems backwards to me. Perhaps it was the smaller engines that were the issue, but we will come back to that. GM wouldn't downsize their compacts until 1980. The now infamous X-body cars were released to much critical acclaim, with the Chevy Citation replacing the Nova. First-year sales were over 800,000, from under 100,000 for the outgoing Nova, which had had sales just under 275,000 when it was last restyled in 1975. Chrysler followed the next year with the also infamous K-cars, the Plymouth Reliant and Dodge Aries, which replaced the Volare and Aspen. Both K-cars sold over 150,000 their first year, a rise of over 70,000 for Dodge and 40,000 for Plymouth, although not even half what the Volare sold its first year, while still being sold alongside the cheaper Valiant. Ford wouldn't get around to downsizing their small cars until 1984, when the Tempo replaced the Fairmont, a variant of which was still being sold as the mid-sized Victoria LTD that had replaced the Granada. Ford sold 400,000 Tempos in 1984, after selling 90,000 Fairmonts the year before, even less than the similar but more expensive LTD. But the Fairmont had sold 460,000 its first year. Ford, however, was ahead of the game in the subcompact market, where the Pinto had dominated the 70s. But by 1980 it had fallen from favor, after a decade of little more than minor updates. And although sales were still 185,000, the smaller Escort of 1981 raised that to 320,000, helping Ford regain the class lead, although it still was less than the 350,000 the Pinto sold its first year. The 82 Cavalier didn't appear that much smaller than the Monza it replaced, but it was 10 inches shorter, and sales were 15,000 more than the 170,000 of the last year of Monza in 1980. Overall, taking into account typical differences in sales of new models versus dated models, It seems that for the most part, the first round of downsizing wasn't particularly successful, but it is hard to say how much can be blamed on the difference in size and how much can be related to other factors, such as the dramatic changes in import offerings, shifting from primarily European to primarily Japanese. Also, in several cases, the downsized models proved to be less reliable, durable, and capable than the models they replaced, although not in every case. And then there was performance, or at least the perception of it, as even the Monza had been offered with a V8 at one point. But perhaps there were reasons why the second round of downsizing seemed to have less competence behind it. GM would downsize their big cars for the second time in '85 and '86, except Chevy, which would hold out until 2000 for a downsized Impala, and the biggest Cadillac, which survived until 1996. And Buick and Oldsmobile would bring back their traditional big cars in the 90s with the Roadmaster and Custom Cruiser. DeVille sales climbed 25,000 to 140,000 with this mid-80s downsizing, while sales of the unchanged Fleetwood Brougham were up 10,000 to 55,000. Sales of the downsized Electra more than doubled to nearly 150,000, while the unchanged LeSabre dropped 6,000 in sales. And then when the LeSabre was downsized the next year, sales dropped more than 45,000, and Electra sales dropped 30,000. When the big Roadmaster returned, it outsold the Park Avenue that had replaced the Electra for 1992 only, while the cheaper LeSabre remained the bestseller of the three. At Oldsmobile, things were pretty similar, although the numbers were slightly higher, and the Custom Cruiser was only offered as a wagon, with total sales under 12,000, or about half what the last '88 wagon of 1985 had sold. Pontiac waited until '87 to replace the Parisian with a new Bonneville, although the Bonneville name had been used on a mid-sized rear-wheel drive car for the previous 5 years, with the new car outselling the previous Parisian by 40,000 and the old Bonneville by 100,000, while Chevy's Caprice Classic got nothing more than a minor facelift for 1986, and sales still fell 10,000. Although sales remained over 200,000, having been creeping back up the previous few years, not getting a downsized front-wheel drive big car until the 2000 Impala, as mentioned before. After the Chrysler LeBaron became the full-sized Fifth Avenue in 1983, and the Dodge Diplomat followed, again by default, Chrysler downsized to front-wheel drive cars like GM in 1988, although the rear-wheel drive cars carried on through 1989. Diplomat sales seem unaffected by the new model, staying about 20,000, while the new Dynasty sold 55,000. Fifth Avenue sales, however, dropped from 70,000 to under 45,000, and the new New Yorker sold a fraction more than the old smaller New Yorker at 70,000. Ford wasn't really having any of it, not introducing a smaller front-wheel drive big car until the 2005 Ford 500 and Mercury Montego, and 2008 for the Lincoln MKS, although the full-frame rear-wheel drive cars continued to 2012. The Ford 500 only outsold the dated Crown Victoria for its first 2 years, and then again when it was renamed Taurus in 2008, while the Lincolns remained close in sales for the years they overlapped. So why the reluctance to get rid of these bigger, dated designs? Partially due to fleet sales. Not the dumping of unsold models into corporately owned rental agency fleet sales, but the real profitable kinds of fleet sales. Taxis, police cars, ambulances, hearses, and limousines. The kinds of uses that the smaller, fully unitized, and less structurally rigid cars were not well suited for. Markets that in recent years have shifted mostly to trucks, out of necessity. Mid-size cars saw similar but shorter-lived reluctance to make the move. GM introduced new, smaller front-wheel drive mid-size cars in 1982, but the old cars continued on for up to 5 more years. The 5-year-old Malibu still outsold the new Celebrity by nearly 30,000 in 1982, although the Celebrity could be had as a 2-door, which was no longer an option on the Malibu. In fact, Chevy sold more Monte Carlos than Celebrities, but Celebrity production was just winding up, and Malibu production winding down, to end after 1983, when Celebrity sales increased by 50,000 and Malibu sales by 1,000. At Pontiac, the mid-sized Le Mans became the new Bonneville, to be sold alongside the new smaller A6000, technically being the Big Pontiac for the year, until the old Big Pontiac returned a year later, as the Parisian. The smaller Bonneville sold just under 80,000, or about the same as the previous year's Le Mans, and about 10,000 less than the previous year's Bonneville Catalina, and about 25,000 more than the new 6000. Then for 1983, the revived Parisian sold just under 20,000, the Bonneville 85,000, and the A6000 just over 65,000. The big medium Bonneville continued through 1986, with similar results at Buick and Oldsmobile, with Oldsmobile's Cutlass being sold alongside the Cutlass Sierra until 1987, and the old Buick Century becoming the four-door and wagon Regal to sell alongside the new Century, while the two-door Regal carried on along with the Grand Prix, Monte Carlo, and Cutlass Supreme, until new front-wheel drive versions were introduced in 1988, although the Chevy was renamed Lumina, and the Olds overlapped for a year as the Cutlass Supreme Classic, by which point buyers seemed to be starting to have had enough of the 10-year-old design, with even Regal sales climbing to 130,000 from under 100,000 of the year before. At Chrysler, the downsized mid-size cars were just stretched K cars that would be sold in several versions. The Dodge 600 and then Lancer, the Chrysler New Yorker and later LeBaron GTS, and eventually the Plymouth Caravelle. These cars were successful only in the sense that they were cheap for Chrysler to produce, as sales figures were pretty dismal for the most part, many not seeing much over 50,000 for their best year. The coupes did better, however. Not that the numbers were higher to start with. The Dodge Daytona and Chrysler Laser also saw sales around 50,000 initially, but that was much better than the 10,000 or less of the outgoing Cordoba and Murata. And when the Laser was restyled as the LeBaron GTC, sales doubled. Once again, Ford was playing a different game, although they did switch to front-wheel drive in 1986. The Taurus wasn't exactly downsized, being only 4 inches shorter on a 1 inch longer wheelbase than the Victoria LTD it replaced. First-year sales were only 135,000, while the previous year's LTD sales were 200,000. However, the LTD overlapped for the year and sold 75,000 that year. And the year after that, when the LTD was gone, Taurus sales would leap to 375,000, on its way to becoming the best-selling car in the country. And the Thunderbird and Cougar did not downsize again, continuing on the Fox format, until they got bigger at the end of the decade. Lincoln did see a second move down, with the Mark VII replacing the Mark VI in 1984, moving from the Panther platform of the Crown Victoria to the Fox platform of the Thunderbird. Although viewed as a more successful car, sales only improved marginally, taking a few years before it matched the Mark VI's best year, after the GM cars fell from favor, because GM's personal coupes faced different issues with the second round of downsizing in 1986, with sales dropping to a third of what they were the year before, and continuing to decline. So GM stretched the bodies at the decade's end, which helped to some degree, once again suggesting that downsizing was not successful from a sales perspective, with few exceptions, which begs the question as to why. Were the changes just too big and fast for buyers to adjust to? But it was more likely that they thought they were getting less car while paying the same amount of money, or more. Was the transition to front-wheel drive part of the problem? Certainly for some people, but downsized rear-wheel drive cars were no more successful than front-wheel drive ones, and in some cases, less so. Was the loss of cargo space and the ability to tow an issue? The increase in light truck sales would indicate that it was. And performance? It's true that a big block big car of the mid-70s was faster than the downsized cars that replaced them. But then a more popular 350 Impala was much slower in 1976 than the smaller 77 350 Impala was. And a later Regal T-Type would blow the doors off a stock 455 Regal from the mid-70s, not to mention what a Grand National could do. And while a base V6 Taurus was no match for a straight 6 Victoria, a later SHO Taurus could outperform a V8 Victoria. So yes, there was a drop in straight-line performance overall, but it didn't appear to have a big factor in actual sales, perhaps partially due to improvements in handling and braking, and of course, mileage. In short, it wasn't a single thing that caused downsized cars to lose sales, but a combination of many factors that made them less appealing to different people for different reasons, who then had to look elsewhere for vehicles that fit their needs. But soon, cars would once again start getting longer, taller, and heavier, with imports growing the most, because every focus group ever asked for more, and more is what would be offered. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.